First, welcome. You're here for the Metropolitan Transportation Plan virtual training put on by CAMPO, the Capital Area Metropolitan Planning Organization, your friendly neighborhood MPO. My name is Chris Lucasina. I'm the Executive Director for CAMPO. We also have Shelby Powell and Alex Rickard, our two Deputy Directors, who will be part of our presentation team today, and Bonnie Parker, who's our Public Engagement Planner, who will also be part of the presentation team as well. A couple of logistics. The presentation does have a couple of question and answer breaks sprinkled throughout. Some of these we anticipate we may have several questions. We'll handle a few of them within a few minutes at each one, but fear not, your questions will be answered either at the end or afterwards, and we'll share those out with the group in some follow-on material that we'll be sending out as well. You can post your questions in the chat at any time. There'll also be some polling questions that we do, scaled polling questions and things. All of that will be on the side panels. I think the standard side panel for WebEx is on the right-hand side, but if you've customized your screen a little bit, it might be somewhere else. But just note that you'll be using the chat and the polling panels throughout the presentation today. The meeting is being recorded, so just keep that in mind, and it may or may not end up on YouTube after the fact. So act accordingly, whatever that means for you. So we'll jump right in. There is a lot of material today that we'll be covering. But generally, we hope that by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of what the Metropolitan Transportation Plan is, who is involved in the development of it, how it is developed, and how that can be important to you and your community. So we're going to jump into a quick polling question. This is to get a better idea of who you all are, and also to make sure that everyone can operate the polling. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a polling question that's popped up. Are you a CAMPO Executive Board member, a TCC member, an alternate for either of those, or none of the above? And we'll just take a couple more seconds here to allow folks to go ahead and respond.
Wow, Chris, we've got a very interactive group today. We've got almost 90%, so I'll go ahead and,
go ahead and close
that. And here it comes.
All right, so it's looking like hopefully you all can see the results there. It looks like the largest percentage of participants today are not on our executive board or on our technical committee, the TCC. So that's good. I hope that tells us that the members of those boards overall understand this stuff, and those that have joined us today want to get a little better understanding or are here to support the MPO staff as we walk through this. So we'll go on to the next question, Bonnie. I think you can advance that, hopefully.
I can. Hold on. It is coming up here. Okay. Can you see this? Why do we develop
so the next question,
an MTP?
Why? So this is select the most appropriate answer question. If you cannot, you should see an A through F option on your screen, on your polling window. If you do not, you look for a little scroll bar and you just have a smaller window, but there is an A through F option for this question. Okay, how are we doing, Bonnie?
Just another moment. We're at 75%, and we've still got several people clicking.
Okay.
Not a minute, a few seconds. All right, guys, we'll go ahead and close this in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, and 1.
It's a game show.
We won't do this too much, you guys. All right, hopefully you can see the results.
Yeah, the vast majority of you have taken multiple choice answer tests before, and when you see an all of the above, you know it's generally the right answer, and that is correct. Those are all reasons that we develop an MTP, and we're going to step through a lot of these through the presentation today. All right. I think I've got control again here. So just a couple of quick things, especially for considering we have so many folks who are not on our TCC, our Technical Coordinating Committee, or the Executive Board. What is the MPO? It's an organization that is federally mandated and mostly federally funded. It is the transportation policymaking organization for our region. CAMPO is one of about 400 MPOs that are across the country in all of the metropolitan areas that have a population over 50,000 people. It's made up of representatives from local governments and other governmental agencies, in particular transportation authorities. And we're responsible for what's known as the 3C planning process, which is the continuing, cooperative, and comprehensive planning process. Each MPO is responsible for, at the highest level, these 5 core functions. The 2 we're going to focus on today are evaluating transportation alternatives and developing and maintaining our regional metropolitan transportation plan. So some of the key things to understand with those responsibilities, again, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, the actual document itself, and we'll go into more depth on this in a few moments. We also are responsible for what's known as a transportation improvement program. Think of that as a capital improvement program focused solely on transportation projects and programs. And we are responsible for making sure our region meets the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which we commonly refer to as air quality conformity requirements. The map here is showing you the Greater Triangle area. On the right-hand side of the map, the orange bounded area, that is CAMPO. So we represent either all of Wake County and the municipalities within Wake County, and parts of Granville, Franklin, Johnston, and Harnett counties as well. And to our west, the Durham, Chapel Hill, Carrboro MPO, which is bounded by the reddish color, is our sister MPO that covers the western side of the triangle. And that's important to note, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. We do a lot of things jointly with them together, including the development of our Metropolitan Transportation Plan. So for CAMPO, our population within this area was about 1.27 million people, or about 12% of North Carolina's population. And hopefully in a few months, we'll update this with newly minted 2020 numbers when the census is released. You can find out more information about CAMPO by going to our website, campo-nc.us, and there's a link to that on this page as well. So our MPO structure, we have a professional staff. We have our executive board, which is the decision-making authority for the MPO. There's a technical coordinating committee, which provides recommendations to the executive board. And then, of course, both the technical coordinating committee and the executive board are the primary conduits and liaisons between the local boards and councils and committees and the MPO. So with that sort of under our belts, let's jump into what the actual Metropolitan Transportation Plan is. It's the long-range guide for our transportation investments in our region. Our plan goes out approximately 30 years into the future, and it contains the recommended major transportation projects, systems, policies, strategies, all of those things to help us maintain our system and grow where needed to meet the region's future mobility and transportation needs. We integrate the MTP development with land use and air quality strategies and those goals for our overall urban area. The plan is a federal requirement for every metropolitan area. Ours is no exception. The plan is required to go at least 20 years into the future. The federal regs prefer 25. I believe right now ours goes anywhere from, depending on where we're at in our MTP development cycle, 26 to 30 years into the future, but generally we're planning out roughly 30 years into the future with our plan. We update the plan every 4 years. It is an ongoing process. This is not something we just do and put on a shelf and wait 4 years and then start up again. The day after the plan is adopted, we're beginning the update cycle for the next plan update. It must be fiscally constrained. It's not a wish list. It's not just a vision plan. It is, we have to show that we will have a reasonable expectation of the revenue and the money needed to implement the things that are included in our plan. All projects must be in the plan if they are anticipating federal funding or meet what is known as regionally significant, and there's actually a very specific definition for that. But basically, those are major projects that connect things like activity centers, major transit, fixed guideway projects, those sorts of things. This plan is developed with extensive public and agency and stakeholder involvement. The current plan is the 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan. We again developed this jointly with the Durham Trumbull Carborough MPO. It was initially adopted in February of 2018, and it has been amended twice since that time. The development of the 2050 MTP is currently underway. So some of the things that feed into the MTP. This is not a standalone project that we do. We go off in a corner, develop the plan, and then come back and say, here's the plan. It's an ongoing cycle. It is essentially the aggregate of a lot of different planning activities that go on in our region. Some of the things that are commonly known as special studies that are done by CAMPO. These might be large area studies that some of you are familiar with or have heard about. The Northeast Area Study, for example, is going on right now up in the Wake Forest, Franklinton, Youngsville, Rollsville areas. We have smaller studies that focus on corridors or on specific what we call hotspots or problem spots. Maybe there's high crashes happening at an intersection, and so we'll go in and look at that. Also, a very important component and building block of the MTP are local land use and transportation plans. These plans are incorporated, and our MTP works to be consistent with those plans and thread them all together and tie them together like a big giant quilt across our region and coordinate between the two or between all of them. And then it's also transit plans and other modal plans that come into that. So for our region, probably the biggest of those is what's called the Wake Transit Plan, and is required for the transit-focused funding that is that was a local option in Wake County. That is also a feeder into the MTP. A couple of examples for you. The Apex Comprehensive Plan. This provides the basis for land use assumptions that are used in the Apex area for the MTP. It's also where where Apex provides what are their local priorities and recommendations for transportation projects and programs up into the region. That's where they feed into it. This helps informs which projects will make it into the MTP, how they're prioritized, at what time frame in our MTP. Another example would be when CAMPO goes out and does what's called a special study. The example on the screen here is the commuting corridor study. This was something that we did during fiscal year 2019. It was a technical analysis of many of the region's major commuting corridors. And it looked at forecasting what outcomes there could be if some very different assumptions were made about the future. So things that aren't in adopted plans right now and adopted local plans, things that maybe current adopted land use plans don't support, but potentially could support in the future. And the idea was to understand how far you would have to move the needle to make some changes in different metrics and different performance measure areas within our region. This will also help inform what types of projects and programs we prioritize and when within the MTP. As I mentioned, our Metropolitan Transportation Plan is a federal requirement and must be fiscally constrained. There's also some state requirements for things that are called comprehensive transportation plans. these are not required to be fiscally constrained. For our region, we have one plan. We commonly refer to it as the MTP, but it also includes our Comprehensive Transportation Plan element. This is multimodal in nature, and it looks out beyond the 30-year fiscally constrained portion of our plan. It's essentially the unfunded projects that are included in our plan that may at some point in the future move into the funded portions of our plan. And this would be what you would really refer to as the vision plan for the region. So how this all fits together, if you think about concentric rings and circles here, the biggest one is the CTP. It's going out for us generally about 50 years into the future. It's not fiscally constrained. A subset of that is our fiscally constrained at least 20-year, but ours generally is more than 25-year Metropolitan Transportation Plan element. And then projects from that are selected and incorporated into that transportation improvement program for the next 5 to 10 years of time and get built by either some sort of local project sponsor, but generally in North Carolina, especially for roadway projects, that would be the North Carolina Department of Transportation that develops those projects. So the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, again, it feeds into, which is updated every 4 years, it feeds into that Transportation Improvement Program. The TIP, as it is known, is updated every 2 years, generally, sometimes 3, but usually every 2 years. The projects in that TIP have to be consistent with our Metropolitan Transportation Plan. And those are generally construction projects, new roads, new road widenings, transit projects, new buses that are purchased by one of our transit agencies, or the fixed guideway, bus rapid transit or commuter rail projects that you probably heard about within our region. On the planning side of things, planning activities, those are incorporated into what's called the Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP. This is updated annually. Think of this as the work program and budget for what the MPO does on a day-to-day basis throughout the year. So how do we develop this MTP? The process for that, again, it's a 4-year cycle, but the last 18 months or so are where you really see things start to ramp up, and we're in that sort of time period right now. So for those of you that are on our TCC or executive board, you know that just a few months ago, we had initial approval of our vision, goals, and objectives updates for the plan. Final approval of that won't take place until the plan adoption at the end of all this. Today, we'll also talk to you about the analysis and evaluation steps in the process. This is really where we're at for the development of the 2050 MTP right now. We'll talk about how we get to the preferred option and ultimately what happens to get to the final plan and then after the final plan. We are required to take a performance-based approach to our planning, where you set goals and objectives, you establish performance measures, you have targets for those measures to see if the things you're doing are going to meet those targets or not, and then how do you adjust to that? And that falls in that last category there of monitoring our progress towards meeting our goals and objectives for the region. This is something that our MPO has been doing for quite a while without the target part of it. But more recently, federal requirements have caught up to that and now require these steps, including targets. And so our MPO periodically updates the adopted targets that we have for various performance measures. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about who's involved in development of the MTP, and then we're going to jump into the how of what we're doing with the MTP and the different steps involved in that. So the first thing to note, I think, is that our region has been recognized over time as a leader in collaborative regional planning. As I mentioned earlier, the Durham, Chapel Hill, Carrboro MPO and CAMPO work together to develop a regional plan. And at the heart of the reason why, most folks don't see some sort of hard boundary when they drive between CAMPO and DCHC MPO or between Wake County and Durham County. That's actually the boundary between our two MPOs. So it makes sense. Particularly when you think about how many people live and work on one side of that county boundary, and do the other on the other side, and the same thing with the other county boundaries as well. So we've been doing a joint development of the MTP for quite a while. Back in 2002, we began to synchronize the process with our partners to the west. In 2009, we adopted the 2035 plan, which back then it was known as the Long Range Transportation Plan, or LRTP. That was the first joint plan that we adopted together, or developed together. Adoption still takes place completely separate from one another, and each MPO adopts their own plan. The 2045 MTP was adopted in February of 2018 again, and that was a joint plan, and we are working down the path of another joint 2050 MTP development. Some of the things that we do together, you can see how much of this is done together, are listed, starting with the goals and objectives, going through all of the tool development, the technical tools and analysis, defining how much revenue we might have in the future, identifying projects that are shared priorities that cross that boundary, and then ultimately that final report. And these were what we used for the 2045 MTP. And at the end of the process, we'll update this to actually show you what we're doing for the 2050, but we're currently on track to be doing all of these same elements together once again. Another important partner in the process is the Triangle J Council of Governments. They help with regional coordination across the two MPOs. They are responsible for some of the elements of the MTP, some of the technical elements that are happening in the MTP, such as the land use side of forecasting and allocating our future land use and the growth for that. They also are the regional administrator for our transportation demand management program. And so a lot of the things related to the TDM that are in the plan come from TJCOG. They also are responsible outside of transportation for a variety of other regional coordination across different issues. And so that helps feed into the plan and helps to ensure that we are coordinating those transportation decisions with other decisions like housing, land use, water quality, all of those. So who else is involved? Elected officials, local governments, transit operators, state agencies, not just the Department of Transportation, private sector, businesses, the public. All of those are involved in some form or fashion in the development of the MTP during various stages. And one of the most important, of course, is all of you. And that's not to get on your good side. It is really important that the local governments and the other agencies that are a part of this MPO participate in the development of the MTP. It is your plan when it's all said and done. So that's who's involved in helping to develop the MTP. And now we're going to dive in a little bit to that update process. And so the first of these we're going to talk about are the goals and objectives that we have. So we have reviewed the existing goals, objectives, and performance measures that we had from our last effort, looking at using data to analyze where we're at today, and also looking at the current planning principles in our region across all the different various comprehensive plans that have been updated since 2018. The result, updated goals and the associated objectives, and we're continuing to work through updating some of the performance measures, and we'll be looking at those targets that we'll set later on in the MTP process. At this point, I'm going to turn it over for a few minutes to Bonnie, who's going to walk you through some of those goals and objectives and some of the engagement that we use during that process so you can get a feel for how that works.
Hi, good morning, everybody. This is Bonnie. And I think most of you know or saw there at the beginning that I work on public engagement for the MPO and have been working with the project team to really develop a robust public engagement effort across the different phases of the MTP. During today's presentation, we're going to share what we're doing or planning or thinking about with regard to public engagement during each phase as we go along. This one's going to have a little more detail, and the rest of the phases will just touch upon the engagement. because those are still in development. And as most of you know, community engagement is always a fluid process that we've got to update as we go along. So the process for community engagement around the goals and objectives is one of the most robust processes in developing an MTP with regard to engagement. We want to make sure that the community, that we do the update work and validate with the community what our high-level vision and goals are for transportation across the region. So you'll see the bolded text here under goals. This effort and during this phase is where we involve the community. It's sort of, if you think about the spectrum of participation, involving the community is sort of the mid-level. What we did this go round is we had 8 goals that the staff between the 2 MPOs and COG and actually other municipal and agency partners assisted with updating a draft set of goals to propose, and we put those out to the community. One of the challenges that we faced was we were developing this process in April, May, and needed to roll it all out in June, July, and August. And as you all know, that was the time when COVID was crazy and we didn't all know yet what we were doing virtually and what the tools and techniques could be to get in touch with the community. So we decided to put a joint survey together using MetroQuest. We also do our official public comment periods before the goals were approved for use in the development going forward for the rest of the MTP. We always have our public comment periods before the board takes action on any of our MTP items. Really what we wanted to talk to the community about or get feedback on was those proposed goals and what their level of support was for each of them. But we also wanted to start to dip our toe in the next phases of developing the MTP so that our technical teams had some information from the community on policy priorities. That'll come into play a little bit later, especially with the scenario planning. And obviously, it's been critical to monitor the demographics of respondents and who we're engaging, making sure that we are reaching target populations. So just very briefly, want to share with you some of the stuff around engagement. This is the MetroQuest survey. We asked folks to rate the different goals, not rank them against each other, but to give us an idea of what their level of support was for the 8 different goals, which you'll see in a moment. And then we also did a quick exercise with them on policies that are common in the transportation realm, and did ask folks to help to rank those to give us some guidance. So with regard to COVID, we had to get really robust, but especially work hard around advertising and making sure people knew the opportunity existed to engage and to access that survey. We did our advertising materials. We did e-newsletters to our contacts at the MPO, but we also did the press release or a press release that much of these materials were joint materials with DCHC, and did actually get the NNO to do an article. And then the big thing I want to share with you all is we also put together resources that we shared with our municipal partners. Our TCC members were very helpful in making sure their communication staff it took these materials, and we tried to package it so that it was very convenient for them to help spread the word. And you can see over on the right just an example of getting some of our municipalities to put out e-blasts as well on our behalf. We did a lot of social media. We also paid some extra money in order to get not only additional ads in newspapers and online newspapers through digital ads, we also put a chunk of extra money into digital advertising on social media across the 3 major platforms. Following that, leading into the updating of the recommendations, we provided both the technical team and our executive board a synthesis of those results and a summary of some of the comments We had hundreds and hundreds of comments that were really great. And we were proud of the community for being on target with the high-level goals and vision. But we really were able to demonstrate staff utilizing that input to update some of the goals and objectives, and we experienced that with the MPO boards as well at their level. So we also have a commitment that we'll continue to use those results going forward, like we said, for guidance around other areas. And then there will be additional engagement that you'll see in a bit. Just wanted to quickly share with you all what those 8 goals are for the 2050 MTP that have now been approved by the Executive Board. They were approved in August. The first is protecting the human and natural environment and minimize climate change. Second is connecting people and places. Next, the third is promoting and expanding our multimodal and affordable choices. And next, the fourth is managing congestion and system reliability. You'll see I'm skipping over all the associated objectives, but these were also approved and get more into detail of how we're going to meet those goals and also tie more directly to performance measures. Our fifth goal was, is improve infrastructure condition and resilience, as well as number 6, a biggie to me, I'm sure you know, is ensure equity and participation, also a biggie for all of our decision makers. Oh no, folks, I think I've lost goals 7 and 8. I wish I could tell you I can remember them off the top of my head, but we'll make sure that those are included in the follow-up materials. And Chris, Shelby, Alex, if you guys remember them, go ahead and put 7 and 8 in the chat. Sorry about that, guys. And so we want to take a quick, pause here for you guys. Does anybody need clarity? That wraps up our vision and goals development section and sort of the intro to the MTP. Now's a good time to ask any questions you might have, especially to clarify something. And we ask that you put those in the chat box, and Shelby and Alex are going to help with sharing those. So we'll wait for about 20 seconds and see if any pop in, and otherwise Chris is going to take back over here.
So Chris, we did have one question, well, actually a series of questions from Emily in Holly Springs. And the first one I'm sure is on everyone's mind. Can you get a copy of the presentation later? And the answer is yes. We will be posting this recording of this presentation on our YouTube channel, and also the slide deck will be posted on our website, and you'll be sent a link after today's training session. But getting into a little more detail, Chris, Emily was wondering more about our air quality non-attainment / maintenance status. So if you can just talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, so we currently have a conforming plan. So all the things that are included in the 2045 MTP are covered by that. We actually have a section of the presentation today that'll talk a little bit about air quality conformity. It's a little bit later in the presentation, but I think one of your other questions there was whether Holly Springs falls within the area, and it does. It is covered by our air quality conformity process. I also posted. Sorry, I was just going to say I posted, and actually Alex and I were typing over each other, but the other 2 goals from the plan, and Alex has posted a link to the MTP goals.
And additionally, I posted a link to the air quality conformity section on our website. And Emily, I'm not sure where you came from, but we don't have PM3 issues here in North Carolina. There's some areas in the western part of North Carolina that have PM 2.5 issues. Here in the Triangle, we've been mainly in non-attainment and maintenance for ozone. The other question that Emily had was there being so many committees and subcommittees, and I think that's kind of an offline question, not directly related to today's training. We actually I don't think, have an updated graphic or list of all of that, Emily, but that's a good reminder for us to update that information, especially as Wake Transit has evolved to have several committees falling under that area as well. So we will be in touch with that. And I also wanted to remind everyone that all of these links that we're posting in the chat today will be sent to you after the presentation.
Thanks, Shelby. All right, I'm gonna hopefully take control. Here we go. And this one there, here we go, yeah. So now we'll jump into the next area of the update process, analysis and evaluation. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the tools that we use for this, as well as how we do this. So one of the initial critical steps in developing our plan is to forecast the amount, type, and location of population and employment growth during our plan time frame. This is known as socioeconomic guide totals, or SE data. You'll hear us refer to it from time to time. These numbers, generally the aggregate number at the county level, comes from the Office of State Planning, as well as looking at U.S. Census Bureau data and a few independent forecast data sets that are commercially available to estimate what the growth will be from what we know as our base year, and for the which is sort of that starting year of our plan, and our ultimate plan year, which in the case of our next plan will be 2050. That information, that data, the population and employment, and especially that growth, will then be allocated across all of the different analysis geographies known as traffic analysis zones, or TAZs, that cover our area, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. These are available on our website, and these are the initial guide totals. They will be updated a few times throughout the process, I suspect, as the Office of State Planning modifies their numbers and the 2020 Census Bureau, or the 2020 census comes out of the Census Bureau. So right now, those numbers you can kind of see for our base year, about 1.3 million people in the region, growing to about 2.3, almost 2.4 million people by 2050, about 838,000 jobs in the region, growing to about 1.7 million jobs in the future. So pretty healthy growth for our region that is currently being forecasted. We take those numbers and we then allocate them across the region using different future growth scenarios. And again, those are based on population and employment, and we evaluate the differing impacts across those scenarios. And a lot of that will be happening in early 2021, and then through the latter part of 2021 or early 2022, we'll ultimately end up with an adopted plan. So how do we get all those dots for population and jobs to land in different parts of the region? So we use what's known as a computer program known as CommunityViz, and it's a tool that's been built and to a degree customized for our region that helps us to understand how growth might happen in our region based on a variety of factors. And there's really 5 inputs that are used for that. But this area is very large, 35,000 square miles. If you think about the number of parcels we're talking about, it's over 700,000. We actually cover 2 full MPOs and a small piece of a 3rd MPO, the Burlington Graham MPO, as well as parts of 4 different rural planning organizations and a whole bunch of local governments, right? So it can be very complex. So we have to sort of operationalize that at a regional level. And with CommunityViz, we look at the location of things that constrain development, so things like water bodies, wetlands, stream buffers, that sort of thing. We look at the types of places that different areas will become, as well as the intensity of what each type of place for each jurisdiction might become in the future. We look at the current development status of the different parcels in the region. So is it fully developed today? Is it partially developed and could have more development? Or is there something there today that might be scraped off in the future and something new will be built in its place? The factors that influence how attractive different parts of the region are known as suitability factors, and they're the things that impact how attractive different parts of the region might be for development. And then we use those guide totals or growth targets as the amount of growth that gets allocated across the region through this community viz model. So what that sort of suitability looks like, think of this as like a heat map. The darker oranges and reds are more attractive to development, and the blues and the darker blues are maybe less attractive to development. And so just to break it down very easily, things like proximity to transportation investments like interchanges on the highway network or transit nodes like future commuter rail stations are things that drive some of that suitability. Also, proximity to major activity centers around our region, or growth planning areas that come from our local governments as well as utilities. We look at all of those things to factor into this process. So Triangle J, this is one of the parts of the process that they help coordinate and actually operate. And on their website, you can see where we have a breakdown of the various different materials that can talk to you and technical guides that talk about how these things work on a very, very detailed and technical level. And we actually have a separate community-based training that's already happened in this cycle, but I'm sure we'll offer it more periodically over time. At least I hope we will. So the next tool we use is the Triangle Regional Model. This is a joint tool that is used in our region. It's a partnership between CAMPO, the DCHC MPO, the North Carolina Department of Transportation, and Go Triangle, our regional transit provider. It's a travel demand forecasting computer model. It's trip-based. There's a typical four-step model. It does have some customization that has occurred, and it's designed to help represent travel in our area. It looks at all modes, all major road facilities, all transit systems and routes, and it also has a component to look at non-motorized travel. So think bicycle and pedestrian trips that are forecasted in the model as well. The red line on the map, I'm seeing a question pop up. The red line on there that goes, sort of the big squiggly red line, is the boundary for CAMPO. There's a purple line that you'll notice is the boundary for the DCHC MPO, but you'll also see that there's a couple of transit lines on this map that are using purple. The purpose of this map is just as a graphic to help you understand. It covers a lot of area, and it covers a lot of major projects and facilities in our region. A key building block of the model is the TAZ, Traffic Analysis Zone. This is it's a way that we subdivide the region into a smaller, manageable study area, and we have thousands and thousands of these TAZs within our region. Each TAZ is typically created along census boundaries so that we can match things up when SE data or socioeconomic data gets updated, and travel trends that come out of the federal government can also be analyzed in our region. Generally, TAZs contain similar land uses within their boundaries, and it's to help simplify the modeling process and help particularly look at trip patterns. So the model does look a lot at origin and destinations from one TAZ to another across the entire region. So we use this model to forecast that future year network performance and trip patterns. It helps understand how highway traffic and transit ridership might impact future land use decisions and travel decisions. And it's used to help test different transportation infrastructure investment strategies. It's also a primary input to the air quality conformity modeling process. And it's also the tool we use when we look at some of the cost-benefit analysis that we do for projects from a mobility standpoint. So we use these tools in the next stage of our MTP development cycle, known as the deficiency analysis. For those of you on the TCC and executive board, this will be happening coming up after the holidays. And so this is probably the most timely piece of this training for you today. The deficiency analysis is sort of a baseline analysis used to measure a worst case scenario in the future. We take our future socioeconomic forecast, so that those population and jobs that we think we're going to get by 2050, and we compare it to what the transportation network is today, as well as the projects that are considered what is known as committed transportation investments. So those that we know will be built, or we have a very high degree of confidence they will be built by that time. So it's not everything that's in our plan. It's those things that really will be listed in the TIP as being constructed and open for traffic or open for travel use by December 31st, 2025 in this case, with very few exceptions. And so we understand from the get-go that this is an unrealistic scenario, right? If we had massive congestion everywhere, then we would likely start to see changes in our growth pattern. But it is useful in setting a baseline to help us understand how other alternatives for the future are going to perform. It helps us helps us better understand where we might spend future transportation dollars. And by illustrating where we see issues with mobility, we're able to better understand where travel demand in the future might be needed. And again, no final decisions are based on the deficiency analysis, but it helps sort of set a baseline to look at all of our other alternatives. So real quick here, those of you who have been around CAMPO a long time know what the tomato maps are. And these are just congestion maps that several years ago someone coined as the tomato maps. They said in the future it looks like somebody took a tomato and threw it at the map and everything turned red. Just like a traffic light on these maps, red means that you're stopped or there's some sort of congestion or delay, and green means you're closer to more free flow travel, right? And the point of this to look at real quick is to understand that things are different through different parts and different times of the day, right? And so using the analysis from the 2045 MTP, you can see that during those commute hours, in the morning commute and the evening commute, is when you tend to see more congestion on the network, right? Whether you're looking in 2013 or 2045, that's what you see. And off-peak times is when you see that the network tends to have less delay, less congestion going on. So we try to look at this throughout the day rather than just at the most congested times of the day when we're looking at these and looking at these analyses. And I think we do have this posted on our website. So if you really want to go and look at it, you can see that animation and the map series. So I think we're going to pause here for a moment for some questions about what we just covered. Do you understand or have a better understanding of how we collect data, how we analyze that data, and how it's used in forecasting?
Yeah, so there are a couple of questions in here. Alex has been providing a couple answers in the chat, but one of the questions was, how does the TRM consider the non-work-based trips? And then the second, what are the key assumptions built into the TRM? Is the mode share expected to remain the same through 2050?
Yes, good. We've got a couple of more detailed questions in there, Alex. So I think it's a timely point in here to note that we are also planning to have a Triangle Regional Model training after the holidays, and we'll get into a lot of those things there. More detail there. The mode share in the model is not hard coded. But you can see in the future, based on some of the things that some of the different assumptions you made, where you can see the mode split change depending on the alternative. Now, at a regional scale, the size of our region, I'll tell you, whenever we do this and you look at the overall regional number, one highway project or one fixed guideway transit project or one transit line do not move the regional scale needle very much. But where we do see changes is when we zoom in on that data and we look within that corridor. You can see great change in some of those areas. For example, with fixed guideway projects, where we tend to see a lot of change in the mode share is within those TAZs along the corridor where the fixed guideway project is going to be. And while generally you'll see an increase in the transit mode share, what we see the most of is actually in non-motorized, where you see a lot more biking and walking trips taking place in those areas. And that's probably due to the greater density and mixed use of land use and development occurring along those corridors in the future. So US 70, sorry, there's one more question in there, I think. US 70 is in the model. That map, again, I showed you a moment ago is just to kind of illustrate that it's a very big area and it covers lots of things. But US 70 and US 70 business are both in the model. Okay. I'm going to keep moving on here, I think, and if we see some other questions come in, we'll try and get them at the end. And if we don't get to a question during the training today, we plan to follow up with these questions and additional material afterwards as well. So moving on to the next step, alternatives analysis and some of that scenario planning, which our current schedule has us doing this somewhere around beginning this in about the March-April timeframe and it running into the early to mid-summer timeframe of 2021. So scenario planning and alternatives analysis are used to explore different alternatives for our growth and development in the future. They also help us to be able to measure against those regional goals and values that we've established in our goals and objectives. Got a little bit of delay here. Here we go. So real quick, I think we're gonna have a polling question here, kind of a pre-test, and guess what? You're gonna answer the same questions afterwards. So the questions are up there for you. Bonnie?
Yeah, and we just want to note that there are two questions here. One is about the why. Do you feel like you understand why we develop and analyze the scenarios? But the second question is how, the mechanics of it. So scroll down a little bit on your poll thing, and if you could answer both, that would be great. And we are getting there. We've got about a third of responses. So a few more seconds here, Chris, for folks to look at both questions.
Okay.
Thanks for staying engaged, attendees. I know it's a lot of stuff. Okay, we've stalled, so I think we're well over 2/3 here. So let's go ahead and here you go, Chris. Here are your results. Back to you.
Okay. So it looks like, from what I'm seeing, the majority of the results were actually no answer. No problem. But from those that answered, how well do you understand why we do it? It looks like there's a pretty good understanding there. The how, as we kind of expected, maybe a middle, an intermediate to lower understanding. But that's because we're about to talk to you about this stuff. So we'll see if that changes at the end of this a little bit. But we'll jump on in here. So some of you will be familiar with this this graphic. It's one that you're going to see a lot over the next few months. But we establish a framework for the alternative scenarios that we analyze. This is what has been discussed with the MPO's executive board and the TCC. It'll be discussed in more, even more coming up in January and into February. But to orient you, this is sort of each box on this matrix represents the combination of a different mobility investment foundation and development foundation. So I think land use along the horizontal, vertical, and mobility and transportation along the top there horizontally. And so the combination of a mobility investment foundation and a development foundation, represent the combination of a land use and a transportation data sets that are combined to run a scenario. And what we used for the 2045 was we looked at several and had a sort of initial first cut, and then the sort of final alternatives analysis looked at the community plans development foundation scenario with a moderate mobility investment, and then an aspirational scenario with a more aspirational transportation investment scenario. So to kind of break this down a little bit, the development foundations look at the land use. The data from that comes from our community viz model that we spoke about a few minutes ago. And it can be informed, and our hope is in the 2050 MPP we'll take updated land use that many of your technical staffs have already provided to us for the future over the last 9 months or so. As well as some of the things we've learned from special studies like the community corridor studies, where we might take some of the themes that we discovered and confirmed or knew and confirmed in that study and apply them in some of these land use foundations. Some of the key things to think about here within the development foundation, we know that there are some places where that are important origins or destinations for trips. These key hubs, we call them anchor institutions and mainstays. Think of things like the major CBDs around the region, the central business districts, the major universities in our areas. RTP might be a good example. And then the mainstays are places with regionally significant concentrations of jobs. They might be some of the mid-sized town centers that we have, or city centers. Some of the suburban centers that we have along our major transportation corridors fall into that category. And for the 2050 MPP, another area that we are looking at incorporating here is what we're currently calling the reinvest neighborhoods, or equity-centered places. And these are places where looking at some of the specific communities of concern in our region, and there's a variety of categories there, we'll look at how different alternatives and scenarios are impacting positively or negatively or both some of these different places. On the transportation side, what we call the Mobility Investment Foundation, this is where we incorporate those future transportation networks. And that would include all the existing facilities out there across the different modes, and what we call the universe of projects. And those are the projects that are already programmed in the TIP. They're projects that come to the MPO from local plans, some of our special studies, our area studies, our modal studies, and then also things that we see from our deficiency analysis that may not have been captured by either local plans or a special study that the MPO has done. We develop different transportation network scenarios that we then use to model across the different modes. Once we've paired the land use and transportation elements together and run the alternatives that are selected to run, we review those results, we compare them against one another and our deficiency analysis, and we measure the performance of the outcome. So these are not the only things that we look at. but you can see we'll look at a variety of different metrics from delay, from where we see jobs and the different employment landing, whether it's within access to different types of transit nodes or not. And then we'll also look to utilize the measures and targets that we're looking at for our goals and objectives to see how each of these alternatives do, how they perform for each goal and objective. And you'll see in this example, some of them will have green arrows, even if they're pointing down. That means that we wanted that particular measure to go down. And so in that example, that would be a good thing. You'll see down there about halfway through on the right-hand side, you have one where you have a blue arrow pointing up and a red arrow pointing down. And what that tells us is that we wanted that number to go up, but it went down in that particular scenario. And so that might be one where we want to go in and look and say, well, is there something we can do to address that red arrow and have it go up rather than down? But that's just some of the ways that we analyze our different alternatives. So I mentioned we have performance measures that we measure against and targets get set. Some of those are required under federal law. We have to include those, and these are some of those. And the PM3, some of that was talked about earlier in the chat. That's one of those sets of performance measures that we are required to have. In addition to these, we have additional measures for some of our goals and objectives that we'll use as well, or plan to use as well. So throughout these stages, we have two main areas that we have goals for the engagement: the understanding of where we're at so far. As I mentioned at the beginning, the MTP is a multi-year ongoing process. The things that are happening in our Northeast area study right now and have been going on for months, or things that happened last year and the year before in our Southwest area study, the input we received and the feedback we got through those processes are incorporated into the development of our MTP. They're part of that engagement process. It's not just when we have a public comment period for the alternatives analysis phase that'll happen probably over the summer of 2021 that we look at community feedback. It's an ongoing process. And then it's also, in particular at this point in the process where we're going to be consulting. We're going to be providing information about the differences between the scenarios, beginning to talk about revenue, and trying to get feedback about those things from the community. And by community, we mean the general public, specific organized stakeholder groups, local governments, other governmental agencies at the regional or state or national level as well. So I think we're going to jump into some polling questions here. Bonnie, if you want to take over.
Yep, this one's taking a second to come up. We're almost there. Can you all see it? Same questions as before, which means there are two questions here. How well do you understand why we develop and analyze scenarios as part of the MTP now that you've received a bit of an overview? And then how well do you understand those mechanics, the how? And honestly, a lot of these questions are going to help us with our future training. We developed this. This is our first pilot of MTP training that's this condensed. And so this will really help us. We're just over half, so a couple more seconds, and then we'll go ahead and close this out. All right, we're at 2/3, so I'm going to close the poll. And here are the results. Back to you, Chris.
Okay, thanks. It looks like maybe a little bit of shift there in the numbers, particularly for the second one, how would I understand how we do it. I think we had a couple of low understandings before, and now we're at 0, so that's good. but definitely helpful input as we think about future trainings on some of this stuff. And it's also a good time to note, particularly for those of you who are TCC members or know of your TCC members that represent your community, there is a TCC subcommittee that will be meeting as we continue to move through this process to be involved in these things as well on a more detailed basis, and to go as we put together those scenarios, there's more involvement there as well. All right. So moving from alternatives analysis into our preferred option or preferred scenario is the next thing we're going to talk about here, as well as a little bit about the financial planning and fiscal constraint that we have to deal with. So how do we get from the alternatives analysis to the preferred alternative? We sort the projects that are desired by horizon year, and we'll talk a little bit more about horizon here in a moment. We have an initial sort of fiscal constraint application. So we kind of set an initial budget that fluctuates and changes as we step through this process, but not generally substantially so. We do a first cut through what we call the payback period method. And then we do adjustments and fine tuning of that. And that is a critical step. It's a step that takes place. The elements of that step are looking at not just mobility, but things like safety, equity, local priority, positive and negative project impacts to the cultural and human environment, and then performance measures and how things happen. And it's probably very important to note that those things happen on the front end of this process before we ever get to alternatives analysis. Most of these projects that are in our MTP, that end up in our MTP, again, come from local plans or from the various plans and studies that the MPO undertakes throughout a four-year cycle, and even more than that in some cases. And all of these areas, projects get analyzed in all of these areas during those early stages and those projects to identify what are good and needed projects that are hopefully containing few negative impacts and lots of positive impacts, or as much as we can get at a planning level across those different areas and elements. And then those are incorporated into the MTP alternatives analysis, and then they're reviewed again. And at this point in the process, you're taking that payback period method to kind of sort the projects into the different time frames and priority. And then you're looking at that and saying, well, you know, here's a project that is probably a little more of a higher priority for the community that it's in. And even though we're saying maybe it should be in the second decade, perhaps there's an opportunity to bring that into or the third decade, perhaps there's an opportunity to bring it into the second decade, for example. So the payback period is a type of benefit cost tool, and it should be noted this is primarily driven by mobility, by delay, or in improvement in VMT, right, and delay benefits. It is a first cut in this stage of the process, and the way it works is that ideally, you would want to run a build, no build scenario for every single project that might be included in our plan. You've seen how large our area is. There's over 600 projects that we're talking about. We tried to estimate a few years ago how long it would take to do that. And we determined it would take more than 2 years of running the model 24/7. It is impractical to do that. So several years ago, we developed this process to approximate the benefits for projects that might be competing against one another in the same model run. Every link of the model has delay that's calculated with and without projects. This comes from our deficiency analysis scenario. We then look at the links within a buffer of a project, and we calculate the VMT and the delay associated with those projects. and then use that benefit or the amount of change there in those metrics and compare that to the cost to build the project that's been calculated and get what we call a payback period. Think of that as the amount of time it would cost for a project to pay for itself in benefits to the region, right? And again, this is absolutely based on mobility metrics, and it only works with the assumption that there's an early look at those other elements: safety, equity, impact to the environment, and some local priority. And then a second step to look at those things to refine the analysis after the fact. So what this does is it helps us take the projects that are desired to be in the plan and put them into 10-year buckets or different horizon year decades of our plan. On the map you see on the screen, this is from our 2045 MTP. The green lines on the map are representing those projects that made it into that first bucket, the first decade of our plan. The orange lines are in the middle bucket, the second decade. The blue lines on the map are the third decade of the plan, and the gray lines out there, those are the ones that ended up in our CTP or unfunded element of our plan. And so each decade includes all of the existing facilities that were already in place, plus the new facilities. So once something was green on the map here, it is also included in the second decade of our plan. It's assumed to be built and open to traffic. And same thing for our third decade as we get to that point in our process. So at this point, what we're doing in terms of engagement and looking for community feedback is to, again, understand how we've gotten to where we're at and get feedback on where we're at with the preferred alternative. And this can take a lot of different forms. Some are high level, like, hey, we don't want to see as much investment in a particular mode, or we want to see more investment in a particular mode of transportation. This project is listed as being funded in one decade. We think it should be in another decade. So it can be at the high level or at a much more micro level that we tend to start to see and get feedback on these things when we're developing that preferred alternative. So moving on into the financial side of things, got a little delay here. Here we go. Another set of polling questions for you, and Bonnie, go ahead and take it.
Okay, I think this one was ready to go. So this is your last set of poll questions for this upcoming section. And we're at this point, we're really focusing on financial capacity and fiscal constraints. How well do you understand why we have to deal with financial capacity and fiscal constraint, but also the mechanics? How well do you feel like you understand our forecasting of the financial pieces and fiscal constraint? And please do note, just a reminder, there are 2 questions. We've got over half, Chris, so just a few more seconds here, everybody. Quite a few people are still in progress, but we are at, one more sneaking in. We are at 2/3, y'all, so I'll go ahead and close this guy to keep us going. And Chris, here are your results. Back to you.
Okay, thank you. It looks like a sort of medium to high understanding of why we do financial forecasting and fiscal constraints, and sort of a middle of the road on how we do it. So we'll jump in here, and hopefully that number 2 question, we'll see a shift by the end of this. So at the highest level, to build this, we look at projected revenues, projected expenditures to get to our fiscal constraint. How do we do that? We begin by calculating the amount of revenue that we think we're going to have, and calculating the cost of different projects. And I'll talk more about those in a minute. But once we have the amount of revenue that we think we're going to have, we have to recognize that some funding categories are limited in their use. Toll funding can only be used for toll projects, for example. The STI law, the Strategic Transportation Investment Law in North Carolina, has a budget and it has limitations on how some of that funding can or can't be used and what types of projects can use the funding. Then we have modal funding, right? There's some funds that can only be used for transit, like the Wake Transit funding, or some funds that can only be used for bicycle and pedestrian projects. And then there's some flexible funding as well. We also have some funding categories that need to be accounted for sort of programmatically and taken off the top of whatever our forecasted revenue might be. Operations and maintenance costs for the system that we already have. System optimization funding, things like the TDM program or ITS programs across the region. These are sort of taken off the top before we start getting into which roadway and transit projects might be funded in the plan. Some funding is already decided. It's already programmed and committed in the TIP. The STIP is the state version of the Transportation Improvement Program. And for those of you who don't know already, our regional TIP and the state TIP must match, and both of those must match our MTP in order for a project to receive funding. And then another category of funding are those funding types that are dependent on development activity. Many of our local communities require new development to invest in the transportation network to some degree. And so that is very dependent on whether development actually occurs or not. So some of the things we've got to think about as we're building our revenue picture. So how do we do this? On the revenue side, we get information from NCDOT since they're the ones who actually get the gas tax, which is the primary funding stream for transportation in North Carolina. We get information from their financial model. We apply inflation factors to both costs and revenues. We get information from the North Carolina Toll Authority on future tolling revenue that can be assumed, and we work with you all and your staffs to get as good of an understanding as we can on what sort of local funding through your local CIPs or general funds, as well as what private development driven funding might be needed to be incorporated into the plan. On the transit side, very similar thing. We work with our transit agencies to understand what their funding streams are going to be through 2050. And we also look at, in particular, the Wake Transit funding financial model. On the expenditure side, we use a cost calculator tool that we have for projects. We override that tool because it's sort of it looks at generic costs with better cost estimates where we have them, whether it's from NCDOT and the project development process, whether it's from a local jurisdiction that has had a cost estimate done or an engineer's estimate done on a project. We'll override that calculator tool in those cases. And the same thing here, we look at costs from the toll authority on toll projects. On the transit side, we take cost estimates from project sponsors that are assumed. We use the Wake Transit model cost assumptions, and then we also look at the operations and maintenance side for transit. So we, across the different decades, when we forecast this revenue, the first decade is really limited to what is in the TIP, as well as what we hear from locals is in their CIP and that near-term development activity. In the second and third decades, we rely more on our forecast of those traditional federal and state funds. And generally, that's where we look at how we've performed with getting funding in the past from the financial forecast that's done by the state. Essentially, think of that as what has been the MPO share in the past, and do we think that it will continue on that trend or change over time? The transit side, primarily, we're getting that, again, from the transit agencies, but a huge component of that is the Wake Transit Plan forecast. And then again, that local revenue. From time to time, we've looked at potential new revenue assumptions, and we'll talk more about that here in a few minutes. And whether we include them in our future forecast or not is always a question that we have. We look at a couple of different financial scenarios. Generally, it's more constrained or more aspirational in the funding. Do we think that revenue is going to dry up at the state and federal level, or do we think it's going to increase at the state and federal level? And in our 2045 MTP, the difference in that question was about $4 billion, so it was a pretty big number. We also need to understand that revenue doesn't always match cost. Again, you can't, just because there might be revenue that seems like it's available, it can't always be used for the same things. Under the state strategic transportation investment law, there's three sort of funding categories: statewide mobility, regional impact, and division needs. And we tend to see that we could forecast, based on past performance, more revenue than we have projects eligible for the funding. Now, obviously, in our final numbers, in that case, the revenue would match the expenditures because we don't have anything to take down that money. If you look on the right-hand side of that, the division needs category, think of that as like secondary roads, bicycle and pedestrian investments, transit investments through that process. The last time around, our identified needs, and this is just showing roadway actually, were far outreaching the anticipated revenue. And so that's where we looked at additional revenue to consider in our plan. So some of the things we've looked at in the past are with additional revenue is, do we replace the current funding and revenue stream altogether? Do we look at something that's in addition to that? We've looked at a variety of things from sales tax based, VMT based, that's vehicle miles traveled based, a property tax surrogate, other user fee things, and then what sorts of funding levels and rules might be applied to that. The key thing to understand here is that any new or additional assumed revenue has to meet regulatory requirements to be included in the MTP. We can't just completely make something come up out of thin air. It has to pass a reasonableness check. So one example, and I'm not going to go through the full details of this, but just to give you a taste of that, in the 2045 MTP, we looked at VMT-based fees as whether or not that was a reasonable thing that we could assume to meet the additional financial needs that we had. And looking at whether, the two options we looked at was, does it replace the current gas tax system? And you can see there, you needed somewhere between 3.8 cents and 5.5 cents a mile to make that work, just to meet current revenue numbers back then. But if we looked at it as an additional thing to the gas tax, then it generated somewhere between, $2.5 and $3 billion worth of additional revenue in the later stages of our plan. And ultimately, the MTP included the latter of those two, and it assumed additional revenue that could be generated by one of three different reasonable means. And we are not required to identify exactly which one we're going to pick, but just to demonstrate that multiple ways could account for that additional revenue we would need over time. So a couple of things that have changed, and that will be impacting us as we step through our 2050 process. At the federal level, the FAST Act, the federal transportation legislation, is nearing its expiration. It has been renewed for a year, but we may have a new transportation legislation package in place by the time we get to our adoption. And what we do feel like is going to be consistent is that this performance-based approach is going to continue to be there. At the state level, particularly with the drop in revenue from the pandemic and other things like some court cases and the natural disasters we had a few years ago, the state is not programming as aggressively per year as it used to. And so we think we're going to see on a year-over-year basis maybe less money available than we had in the 2045 MTP. And some of the eligibility rules have changed. And then at the regional level, we're in the midst of an update of the Wake Transit Plan. vision plan and how much revenue we're going to see from that in the financial model. It hasn't been finalized yet. And of course, probably one of the more fluctuating ones of these is that local funding piece of the pie. So some of the continued challenges that we see in particular is that local and regional revenue option or options. What those look like, what the appetite is for them will have a big impact on ultimately what makes it into our plan that gets adopted and what actually gets built and implemented for the public to use. So I think this is a quick point to stop and ask if anybody needs any additional clarity on how the revenue, the financial forecast and fiscal constraint are put together.
And Chris, this is Bonnie with a quick update. We're going to skip that final poll question since we just have a few minutes here so that you can move on. So just jump over that one.
Yeah. And I see in the chat there, we've got a couple more detailed questions, maybe coming from Jason. And Alex is answering those a little bit, but we'll definitely follow up with you, Jason, on some of those questions that you have there. One question about the performance measures. So the answer to that, Emily, is both. Again, some performance measures are required under federal regulations. And in that case, we have them, and they've been told to us. In terms of the targets, we work with the state and with our transit agencies for the transit-related measures and targets to set those. We do have additional measures beyond the required ones that we are looking at. For the 2045 MTP, we had many more non-required measures that as a region, we were saying these are important to us. We backed off of some of those for the final 2045 MTP adoption and moved them more to a monitoring and continuing to develop sort of status based on advice from U.S. Department of Transportation. I think this time around, we'll see more of those actually get adopted because everyone now has 4 years of experience dealing with performance measures and targets under their belt. And I think there's more confidence that on how that whole process is going to work. The 2045 MTP was the first go around for that for all of us in this region. And so I think we have more confidence that we'll understand how that process will work into the future. Specifically for the required performance measures, though, which is maybe what your question is, those our MPO had, for the ones that are set, that the state has set a target, we have agreed with that target for all of those performance measures and targets. With the transit agencies, we've coordinated with them and worked collaboratively to set those, and then we'll be monitoring them over time. Okay, so moving into the final plan. Oh, I gotta take control here again. There we go. So once we have that preferred plan and that sort of final draft of the plan, the next step is an initial approval step by the CAMPO Executive Board. And that is to sort of set the plan and lock it down to a degree so that we can begin the air quality conformity process. The air quality conformity process is a required process that we have to go through to show that our plan for the future complies with federal air quality regulations. The analysis demonstrates that the total ozone causing pollution expected from all of our planned projects and programs are within the limits established under the state implementation plan, which is the plan that covers our entire state, and each state has one that has to deal with air quality. The input for the output from our Triangle Regional Model is put into what is currently known as the MOVES model, which is an air quality modeling a computer package that was developed by the EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And the output from that tells you across a variety of different pollutants, air quality or air pollutants, how your region is doing. And that is then used to determine whether or not our plan will meet air quality requirements or not. Assuming that it does, the plan is then taken back to the MPO Executive Board, and the final adoption action is taken to incorporate and certify that the plan is, that we do have a air quality conformity determination on the plan. Generally, between that initial approval and the final adoption during that air quality conformity process, there are no significant changes to the plan. Occasionally, there might be a minor update made if we recognize that the intended thing was in there, maybe in the plan document, but the network it had it in the computer model wrong. We can make those adjustments, that kind of thing. But if it's, well, we had project A in there and now we want project B instead, those sorts of things are different and would generally be handled after we got through the adoption process through an amendment. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. But at this stage, as we're going through that final adoption process, again, we're focusing on with community feedback, making sure they understand all that's gone into it, that we have had this engagement continually throughout the process, identifying those things that maybe were updated or changed based on the feedback that we got through the alternatives analysis and into the preferred alternative, and any changes made to the preferred alternative, particularly if we run into an issue with air quality conformity, to make sure that the community understands, while this project may have been desirable, we had to do something else to meet federal requirements. And this is generally a review of that final plan, including the air quality conformity information before the final approval by our executive board. So once we have an adopted plan, what happens if we need to change the plan? There's two categories of that, right? The first one is technical corrections. These are things that are minor in nature. You can kind of see those listed on the left-hand side of the screen. These do not require public review and comment. They don't require us to re-demonstrate fiscal constraint or air quality conformity determinations over again. For more major changes, these are what we call MTP amendments. And those are where we have major changes across a variety of different types of things. It could be the alignment of a project. It could be the addition or removal of a project. Those are sort of major changes that can happen. Those would require public review and comment. They would likely require re-demonstrating air quality conformity, and most likely some sort of fiscal constraint re-demonstration, unless the project cost didn't change somehow. But generally, if you're adding a project or removing one, if you're having a major change in the alignment of the project, those tend to have an impact on the fiscal constraint as well. It's important to note the amendment change to the MTP is not something that is done lightly. It is a major process to do that, and it can take anywhere from 9 months on the short side to 18 months on the long side to process an amendment, depending on what's going on. To give you an example, as I mentioned, the 2045 MTP has been amended twice. The second amendment we're still actually in the process of that. It's been approved by our board, but it has not completely finished its conformity process. It was to amend the alignment of what's known as the Western BRT corridor as that project begins its process through the Federal Transit Administration funding cycle pipeline. There was a change in the alignment from what was in the MTP, and it has been, I think we're at month 4 right now, and it is actually I think we're at month 5 on that right now, and it's likely going to be another 3 to 4 months before that is finalized. So these are when an amendment is needed, we start asking a lot of questions to find out whether or not it is needed right away or whether it's something that can wait for our next regular MTP update cycle. So upcoming milestones for our 2050 MTP. Deficiency analysis is next on your plates, right? And that'll be happening in late winter, early spring. After that, we get into the alternatives analysis, and we also begin the revenue forecast and the preliminary financial planning efforts. By the end of the summer, beginning of fall, we're getting through the alternatives analysis and getting to that preferred plan, and based on fiscal constraint and how smoothly that does or doesn't go, we end up with a final draft plan, which would go for its initial adoption by the MPO's executive board in the fall or early winter, with conformity taking place, air quality conformity taking place during the winter, and the final plan adoption right now is targeted for February of 2022. So I will tell you that throughout the MTPs that we've done, this schedule tends to shift a little bit based on how things are going with the different stages, but generally it doesn't extend too much longer than what we're showing here. So that's what you have to look forward to as we continue through our 2050 MTP update process. Going on to our next thing here, I think we're nearing the end of our presentation here. I want to make sure, we want to make sure you have some key takeaways. And I think some of the key takeaways for you as far as the MTP goes is that it's one plan for the region. It's the singular vision that's been combined from all of our individual plans and visions for the future at the regional level. It's important that we have good coordination across the jurisdictions and that you all continue to be active participants in the process. Right, and whether that's through your TCC member, through working with your community. For those of you that are TCC and executive board members, you are a very important conduit back to your community and in between your community and the MPO. Project funding, the MTP is how you get those major projects funded. If you want transportation funding from state or federal sources, the projects need to be in the plan. If it's a project that, even if it's going to have local funding only, if it's a regionally significant project, those major connecting threads in our region that connect activity centers, that connect employment centers, that are fixed guideway transit projects, as some examples, those, regardless of the funding source, are required to be incorporated into our plan as well. If they're not in the plans, they won't advance through for funding or for some of the key development decisions that you need, whether it's the NEPA or SEPA process, those sorts of things. And then also remember, we've got continuing challenges to look at, and one of the biggest ones there is on the funding front. What do we do with local or regional funding in the future? Our region is one of the few in the state that has chosen to implement a local option sales tax that's dedicated to transit. Are we going to think about those things in the future? Are we going to think about those things beyond just one mode and look at more multimodal funding sources at the regional level or not? Some of those are key challenges for our region. A couple of things to think about to be successful with the MTP, both in the development process and then after, once it's adopted. I think, again, it's important to stay plugged in to the MPO and to this process, to stay involved, to be and make sure that if you are not a TCC or executive board member, that you ensure that you have an active conduit into the process, both directly with us and through them on our boards. We want to make sure that you all help us to make sure we have a good understanding of your communities, what's out there today, what you want to see in the future, whether it's through policies or projects or other priorities. And also that hopefully you are an ambassador back to your community, both for informing, but also to help encourage your community to participate in the process. And that by that we mean the general public, specific stakeholder groups in your community, but also your governing board and administration for your local government too. And just to kind of close this out here, a couple of things to maybe be thinking about over the next 30 years. They're going to be very different than the last 30 years. Maybe the one constant will be we're anticipating lots of growth in our region. We know that our transportation system will need to be more robust. So maybe a couple of questions to leave you thinking about and help prep you for the next several months of MTP activity are, what important transportation priorities do you think should be a part of one or more of our scenarios? And in a few months when we start really talking about those alternatives, it'd be good for you to have that kind of thinking already in your mind. And then the second one, what else should we be mindful of as we consider long-term investments for mobility within the triangle, within our region? So a couple, I think, of key questions to think about over the next month or two as we begin to step into the deficiency and alternatives analysis for the plan update. So just a couple of reminders as we get to the end here. We will be sending out follow-up material to all of you that participated today. We'll have the slide deck, a link to any recordings that we post, as well as some additional material on a couple of things that we've seen in the chat, and that we're planning to give you some more information on. You know, for those of you who really want to get into some more of this material. We plan to have a post-webinar survey, so when you get that, please also look at that and complete it for us. And of course, we're your friendly neighborhood MPO. We're always here for you. If you have other questions, thoughts, ideas, please send them to us. We have an online form you can fill out. You can email us. You can call us. We are always happy to talk to you all and get feedback and input, particularly when it comes to development of the plan for the future. And so with that, I just want to say thanks to Bonnie and Alex and Shelby for their assistance during this presentation, and all of you for participating as well. I also want to put in one plug for the future here, and this will get at some of the questions we got early on, particularly about like the committees and things. We have another training that's scheduled for February 25th, 2021. It's a little bit of a long training, but it is the MPO 101 training, and it talks to you about how the MPO works, the different committees, processes, policies, all those things that are out there. And for those of you who are new to MPOs or new to CAMPO, that's a very good training event to look at. And so I know we've gone a little bit over our scheduled time, and lots of questions that came up in the chat, and hopefully lots of answers I saw going back and forth. But we are happy to stay on for a good little bit of time here. So for those of you that have to leave us, again, thank you for taking the time to participate in this. More information is coming your way. For those of you who'd like to stick around and maybe ask a few more questions or try and get some more information, we'll be sticking around on this webinar for a little while too. Thanks, everybody.